Welcome back, everybody, to On the Ball, the video podcast series from Vanderbilt Sports and Society Initiative. Really excited to have Jules Boykoff with us today. Jules, you're somebody who I've followed, your writing and your social media for years, but this is the first chance to talk to you, not quite in person, but virtually in person. And so thank you so much for taking the time.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm such an admirer of your work, and this is really fun. So thank you.
Absolutely. Well, when I think of you, I think of someone who's really on the edge of the whole notion of sports and society, and using sports as a way to talk about social issues that matter to everyone, whether you have an interest in sports or not. And so I was really excited to have a chance to read your new book. I think I told you in an email, flying up to Wisconsin through Chicago for an event on sports and society at St. Norbert College in De Pere, Wisconsin, which is right across the river from Green Bay. And I'm a Packers fan, so it was great to have a chance to go up there and great to have a chance to read your book on the way. But the title is the 1936 Berlin Olympics, Race Power in Sports Washing. And we'll get to the themes in the book, but I also noticed that it said it's part of the Sport and Society Teaching Pocketbook series. And for those who haven't seen it, it's sort of like a pocketbook sized book. Can you tell me about that series? I was just curious about that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the editors are Jorg Krieger and Lindsay Piper, and they were both wonderful to work with. The idea is that these books are written for people who are in high school or college, undergraduate, kind of an introduction to a topic and a good chance to think deeply about that topic. And the books are supposed to be in the neighborhood of 30,000 words, so gobbleable in a plane trip, say, to Wisconsin. So, that's really the goal of them, is to make them readable and make them relatively short and, open up the possibilities for young people to think about these issues more deeply.
Yeah, well, I thought you did a fantastic job with that. And I have, a special interest in this topic. One of my books, it's called Games of Deception, is on the first U.S. Men's Olympic basketball team, which played at the 1936 Olympics. And, I didn't use the word sports washing in that book, but the theme of it, I hope, shined through. And, the idea for me was the deception of these Olympics being meant to fool the world into believing that, hey, maybe Nazi Germany, what I've read about it so far, isn't so bad. And we're going to put on such a great Olympics that's well organized and colorful and friendly that, we'll be able to fool people. And also to even change attitudes within the country. Look, the world came, and they admire us. So that dual purpose. But for those who are unfamiliar with the term sports washing and that concept, can you explain that?
Absolutely. So, sports washing is the idea that when political leaders host big events like the Olympics or the Soccer World Cup, they can use them to burnish their reputations on the world stage and to distract us from some of the real problematic issues that are in their societies. So, classic examples include pretty recently the Beijing Olympics in 2022, try to distract our attention from the treatment of Uyghur Muslims in the country, the treatment of Hong Kong democracy activists, and so on. But it goes all the way back in history. The funny thing about the sports washing is that it's a relatively new term. It was really only coined less than 10 years ago, but it has been around, its component parts, going all the way back to those Berlin Olympics that you wrote so eloquently about in Games of Deception, and that I took on here in this book. And, the last thing I would say is, though, while today we're talking mostly about Berlin and an autocratic authoritarian situation, the way I've written about sports washing is that it can also happen in democratic contexts. And just one example of this would be the upcoming 2028 Olympics in Los Angeles. The mayor of the city of Los Angeles, a guy named Eric Garcetti, when they were going for those Olympics, said that if they were given the Olympics, they'd be able to end street homelessness by the time the Olympics rolled around. Well, that does not seem to be happening. And Mayor Eric Garcetti is now no longer mayor. He's the ambassador to India. But my point is just that sports washing is often pegged onto authoritarian regimes, and that definitely happens, but it also can happen in democratic contexts.
And you write in the book that the 36 Olympics were the first sort of major example of this. And correct me if I'm wrong, but at first, so Berlin was awarded the Olympics before Hitler came into power. And I believe at first he was opposed to the idea of this international event that would bring, all sorts of people to Germany. But then he was convinced, maybe by Goebbels or others in his regime, that this would present an opportunity for propaganda. Is that your understanding as well?
Exactly. So if you read Mein Kampf, and I actually did from front to back for writing this book, not a very pleasant experience, let me tell you, but it had to be done.
Uh-huh.
If you read Mein Kampf, Hitler's book, you'll find that he really doesn't talk about the Olympics at all. He doesn't really talk about sports at all. I mean, really the only sport that he mentions with any kind of detail is boxing, which fit with his kind of macho way of thinking about the world. And so absolutely he had zero interest in the Olympics when they were put in front of him as a possibility. But Joseph Goebbels said, oh, no, this is going to be an incredible opportunity for propaganda. Not only that, but I mean, the people that were running the Olympics came up with this new way of spreading Nazi propaganda all around Europe. And that was they created the Olympic torch relay, that same event that happens right now when the Olympics come to your city and country. It started in 1936 with these Olympics in Germany. And so what it was it started the Olympic flame in Greece, as it always does. And the torch kind of wended its way through Europe, all these areas that the Nazis eventually invaded. And so you had the Olympic rings going along with the torch, of course, for the Olympic relay, but you also had the Nazi propaganda symbols such as the swastika accompanying it. And this became pretty ubiquitous. It became very common to see both the Olympic flag and the five rings that everybody knows so well, alongside the Nazi symbology like the swastika, all the way through the Olympic Games themselves. So yes, Hitler was not keen at first, but quickly realized, as so many other autocrats do, that such sporting events could create a real propaganda opportunity, not just for the world and thinking about other countries that they might like to convince to join their side or maybe invade if they don't want to, but also, as you mentioned, a crucial point that's often missed with sports washing is domestic audiences at home are crucial. And so you look really important if you're Hitler. You get this big international event, and people domestically that might have been on the fence about Hitler and the Nazis were like, wow, well, the rest of the world seems to be appreciating him. The New York Times is writing all these wonderful things about how he's the new Caesar and all this. So maybe he's not so bad after all. So it kind of quietly quell dissent at home as well.
Well, a couple of things I wanted to pick up there. First one to ask you about, why is the IOC such a great fit with these authoritarians who would like to use, sports washing to burnish the image of their regimes? It seems like they go hand in hand, and you see people like Avery Brundage, who rise within the ranks of the IOC after partnering with the Nazis rather than having their careers ruined, through that association.
Yeah. Well, the International Olympic Committee was started by a French aristocrat, a plucky baron by the name of Baron Pierre de Coubertin. And when he created the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, he essentially packed it with other barons and dukes and lords. So there was, from the outset, this sort of aristocratic sheen to the organization. Unless we think that was just something from the 1890s, it's actually pretty remarkable today in 2023 what a high percentage of people that are lords, barons, and sheikhs now. The IOC started letting women in 1981. Yes, Andrew, you heard me correctly, 1981. This is not a proto-feminist organization. And so now they have princesses. But going back to the beginning, because it was so aristocratic, there was this idea of kind of deference to power. And that really helped Hitler. At this time in the 1930s, the Olympics were really only getting their sort of social and global footing. The first Olympics that was really maybe successful and sort of resembled what we would see today would be the Stockholm Olympics of 1912. And then there was this pause during World War I. And so really the Olympics of 1936 were not what they were today, but the International Olympic Committee, they didn't have a ton of options at that time either. And they basically said, okay, we're gonna do this. Even though Hitler came to power in 1933 after the games had been allocated, they can work with them. Skipping forward to today, there have been IOC members who have stated quite publicly and openly, that actually it's a lot more convenient to work with dictators than it is those democracies where people are asking pesky questions about how taxpayer dollars are being spent and so on. And so we got a glimpse of that dynamic that's in play today, way back with Hitler. The last thing I'll say,
Mhm.
you mentioned Avery Brundage, and he was known by African American athletes as Slavery Avery Brundage. And to write this book, I went back through his archives, which are available in numerous places, including the University of Illinois,
Mhm.
Western University up in Canada. And I went through his personal papers, and wow, there are some stunning remarks that Avery Brundage makes about his appreciation of the Nazis. And this is years after we know what happened with Hitler and the Holocaust. And he just was heaping praise on Germany for 6 or 7 years during the 1930s. They could do basically nothing wrong in his eyes. So
Mhm.
there were leaders, particular leaders inside of the International Olympic Committee that had similar viewpoints, honestly, to the Nazis. Brundage was anti-Semitic, he was racist, and those views, of course, chimed pretty mightily with the Nazis in Germany.
Yeah, I visited those archives at the University of Illinois also, and I was just taken aback by the volumes of anti-Semitic literature that, the magazines he was subscribing to, the anti-Semitic letters he was receiving that were signed Heil Hitler, Heil Brundage. And, I say in my book, well, you can't necessarily hold it against him, the letters he was receiving, but you can the responses he would send back, for praising these people who were using that language. You mentioned the press, and it seems like the American press, for the most part, bought hook, line, and sinker this propaganda that was being directed at them in Berlin. To what degree did the American press really assist Hitler in achieving his goals at these Olympics?
Both you and I used the U.S. press in our books, and it's really interesting when you look at what the paper of record was saying about Hitler and the Nazis in the 1930s, and by that I mean the New York Times. And as I alluded to before, they called him the new Caesar at certain points. Coverage was glowing, even breathless at times. I mean, the praise that they were heaping on Hitler was kind of wild until you start thinking about, wait a minute, that's the United States in the 1930s. This wasn't exactly some kind of racial paradise there either. We
Mm.
were operating under Plessy versus Ferguson. So the idea of separate but equal, even though that wasn't actually what happened in practice, the equal part at least. And so the context in the United States was pretty grim in terms of racial relations. And I just might say, as a side note to the question around media, was that the Nazis were very closely studying what was happening in the United States. And in terms of immigration laws, in terms of interracial marrying laws,
Mm.
and sometimes they were like, whoa, US, you've gone too far
Too
there. Like,
far,
that's way
right?
beyond
Yeah.
what we want, right? Like, slow down there, racist. That's the Nazis looking at the US. And so maybe that helps us make more sense of the fact that the New York Times and other papers heap praise on Hitler and were pretty positive of the Olympics. But it's not uncommon for the Olympics to get positive coverage during this time frame. I think the last 15 years or so, we've seen much more critical media coverage of the Olympic Games in the modern era. But back then, it's just pretty common to have papers saying, yeah, this is a great event, not really problematizing some of the uglier underbelly sides, and strangely, perhaps not really problematizing the role that Hitler played in it all.
One of the things I thought was so intriguing or illuminating about studying Avery Brundage, at the same time that he is saying, sports and politics should be kept separate, he certainly had an agenda for saying that, and was not even abiding by it himself. Where I, found letters where he's writing to Nazis, asking them to, send quote unquote positive coverage of their regime to American newspapers to influence public opinion here. So, he couldn't even take his sort of false argument at face value because he wasn't abiding by it himself. But on the other hand, you make an argument that an organization like the IOC, if its goal is to preserve the Olympics, to keep the Olympics going, could you make an argument that they really can't, make decisions on where the Olympics are held based on what's happening in that country? Could have made a case that they shouldn't have come to the U.S. in 32 based on racism here. I mean, probably you could find something with every country that would be a reason to avoid that country.
No question that there are countries around the world that have major problems with human rights, including the United States. I interviewed Minky Worden from Human Rights
Mhm.
Watch recently, and she said that every country around the world has human rights issues, but there are different degrees, she noted. And certainly, getting ready for a Holocaust is different than the kind of blatant racism that was happening in the United States. Of course, there were lynchings. There were about 57 documented lynchings in the United States between 1933 and 1936 as Hitler and the Nazis prepared for those Olympics. So I certainly don't want to say that there wasn't racialized violence. There was plenty of it in the United States.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think that's a question. That's a good question that the International Olympic Committee has had to face from way back when the Nazis hosted the Olympics in 1936, but also even last year when Beijing was hosting the Olympics. Now, the IOC will tell you, hey, look, we cannot get involved in regular politics in these different countries. We can only kind of control the Olympic sphere. But like I think you're noting, Andrew, it's kind of a selective morality situation because they say they don't want politics, but what they really mean is this kind of
Right,
politics, like
right.
progressive politics. And, the last thing I would say about this is if the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, were just to follow their own guiding documents, say the Olympic Charter, for example, it would automatically exclude some of these countries from being able to host because they're just so extreme, the violations, against LGBTQ people, for
Mhm.
example, when there are provisions these days in the Olympic Charter that says you can't discriminate people because of their sexuality or gender, and yet countries do, and they get to host the Olympics. And so I think that is one place where the International Olympic Committee today could certainly learn from the past and actually just stand up for the ideas in their own charter. And
Their
that
own
could go a
charter.
long way in terms of improving the
Yeah.
host countries.
I really picked up on a line you had towards the end of the book. You said the IOC's self-declared neutrality is a form of bias that presses in the direction of power. And I think that when I speak to kids, and I do a lot of speaking at middle schools and high schools about my books, and I think the lesson of Perry Wallace's story as a pioneer in the SEC, or the lesson I try to convey in the book about the 36 Olympics, and coming from Elie Wiesel, is there's just the danger of neutrality, and how it always supports the oppressor, never the victim. And so even to say keep sports out of politics out of sports is a political statement in and of itself,
Mhm. Yeah, I
supporting
mean, I think the
power.
IOC puts forth this brand of what we could call maybe pathological neutrality. And the
Mhm.
great Howard Zinn said you can't be neutral on a moving train. And the Olympics are definitely this moving train moving into the globe and across the globe. And yeah, it's just sort of fanciful to think that you could be neutral in these situations. You should just stand up for your principles when they come to be questioned by some of these host cities, if you ask me.
Mhm. And another quote was from George Orwell, and he said international sporting contests lead to orgies of hatred. And that is so counter to the image that is, put forth by Olympic broadcasters or sponsors, and these stories of international goodwill and the friendships that, emerge from the Olympics. And so when you think about the 36 Olympics, not only was it a distraction, but it was leading. Do you feel like that this actually propelled the road to the Holocaust?
I do. I mean, I'd be careful not to overstate the role of the Olympics. There was a
Mhm.
whole lot of other things going on in Germany at that time. But the fact that they hosted the Olympics, they pulled it off, the whole world showed up and left saying positive things about Germany. It certainly helped Hitler create that base of support in the country to then go on and invade all these countries and then ultimately, carry out the Holocaust. So I'm careful not to say it was like the one factor and
Right,
that the
right.
Olympics, ruled the day, but certainly it was in the mix of important factors that paved a path there, no question.
Um, the other thing I wanted to ask you about was the boycott effort. And I was surprised when I was doing my research on the strength of the boycott effort, especially in the United States. There'd never been one, directed at the Olympic Games before, but came pretty close to succeeding. Can you talk about, who was driving that, the arguments that were being made, and how close that came to succeeding?
Absolutely. So, for starters, it was really obvious. I mean, the anti Semitic writing was on the wall. People knew what was happening in Germany. And that gave a lot of force to people that thought they didn't want to support it by showing up. It would seem like they were condoning this kind of anti Semitic and racist behavior. And so, certainly, Jewish groups in the United States were standing up and saying, whoa, we can't do this. But it wasn't just Jewish groups. I mean, the NAACP at one point was supporting a boycott. So support for the boycott of the 1936 Olympics in Germany was very widespread. And in fact, it came quite close, as you're noting, to passing. I mean, so there were two main organizations, sporting organizations in the United States, the American Olympic Committee, one of them, and they were in favor of going. They had to convince the AAU to have them go along as well. And it went down to the wire. I mean, they didn't decide to go until December 1935. And of course, the Olympics were in the summer the following year. And so it was actually pretty close in terms of Olympics. And I think that points to a couple of things. One, the strength of movements at that time in the 1930s. You know, the communists were very strong here in the United States at that time. And not just the communists, there were other groups, socialists and non-communist and socialist groups like the NAACP. And also, I think it points to the fact that what was happening in Hitler's Germany was really extreme. I mean, it's not like you see boycott movements pop up for different Olympics that aren't so extreme. It's got to be a pretty extreme situation for a boycott movement to emerge, and that's certainly what happened here in the United States.
And I wanted to ask you about your the way you characterize Jesse Owens. You know, and a lot of people look at him as a hero of those 36 Olympics, and through his success on the track, you know, disproving notions of Aryan supremacy. In the book, you write that he actually was on record of saying some pretty nice things about Adolf Hitler, and you know, seen by later generations of Black athletes and activists as too conservative in his views. How do you assess Jesse Owens in terms of the decision he made to compete there? You know, I think at the time he felt that was the best thing he could do. I know Sam Balter, who was a Jewish player on the American basketball team, also felt like boycotting was not the right choice, and that going and winning a medal would be a way to disprove Hitler. Did they accomplish anything by succeeding in Berlin? And what do you think of the choices that athletes like Jesse Owens made?
Yeah, on one hand, Owens is clearly the big celebrity athlete wise at these Olympics, and his performances were able to sort of shatter the Aryan supremacy myths that Hitler and the Nazis were sending around. No question about it. And had the United States boycotted, we wouldn't have seen him win 4 gold medals, and we wouldn't have seen Hitler have to squirm as all these African American athletes, including Mac Robinson, other people, did so well. So there's a whole lot of value in that. There's no question. But on the other hand, you know, Jesse Owens is kind of a tragic figure in some ways, because for a number of reasons. One, right when those Olympics were over, he knew that that was his time to cash in. And so he didn't go on this highly exploitative tour of track athletes where they were just supposed to basically go and keep performing for crowds and making a little bit of money. He got some bad advice from a lot of different people that this was his chance to make a lot of money. A lot of those deals fell through, and he really struggled. I mean, this was a very racist country in the 1930s that he returned to, and he was pretty bitter about Franklin Delano Roosevelt not sending him notes of congratulations. I think that's really what inspired the comments that like Hitler wasn't so bad. I mean, FDR didn't even really send anything to me positive. I mean, many of the local papers mainstream papers didn't cover Owens in a lot as much depth as we would expect today. And so, you know, he ends up kind of becoming kind of a conservative guy. He ends up campaigning for Alf Landon against FDR, and you know, eventually he gets his financial footing, but it takes him a long, long time to do so. I mean, I'm talking to you from Portland, Oregon. He owned a baseball team here for a while. As many of your listeners and viewers here will know, you know, he had a sort of race against horses, you know, kind of a demeaning way of making money. And that's why I'm saying he was kind of a tragic figure. And like you mentioned, Andrew, he was trotted out by the International Olympic Committee and Slavery Avery Brundage, you were talking about before, to try to tamp down the activism from African American athletes around the 1968 Olympics, people like John Carlos, Tommy Smith, Wyomi Tyus. And it didn't work, for starters, obviously. And it just kind of, when you read the biographies of Carlos, Smith, and Tyus, you know, they're just sort of almost like feel bad. Like, here's this guy trying to just way out of tune with what we're talking about now in the current era. And he's kind of doing the IOC's bidding. It was just sort of like a sad story and an ineffective effort to try to intervene. And so, you know, on one hand, he's an incredible athlete. His story is amazing. And it probably is a really good thing that he went to Germany in terms of shattering myths, both in Germany and the United States. But in the long run, it's a pretty tough story when you really break it down and think about kind of the wider political repercussions of some of his actions.
What do you think is the or maybe I shouldn't ask you what you think other people should do, but what do you do? Like when the Olympics come around every 4 years, are you watching on TV and enjoying the sports aspect of it? Do you feel like that's hypocritical in any way? Uh, what do you do?
Well, I deeply believe that we need not devote ourselves to the death of complexity, which is to say, we can both critique the International Olympic Committee and a lot of the unjust processes that are around the Olympics. And there are a lot of them, from overspending of taxpayer money to gentrification and displacement of local working class people to the militarization of public space that sticks around after the game to greenwashing. And there's a lot more. I mean, we can critique that, but at the same time, appreciate the athletes. I mean, I very much look at these athletes as athlete workers. And especially now, Andrew, we're living in this pretty incredible moment of athlete empowerment where a lot of Olympic athletes are coming together and realizing, you know what, we deserve a bigger piece of the money pie. And the facts really bear out that they do. I mean, just a side note, Toronto Metropolitan University came out with a study recently that compared big leagues like the National Basketball Association, National Hockey League, National Football League, the English Premier League of soccer or football. And in those leagues, athletes get about 45 to 60% of the revenues, 45 to 60%. Olympic athletes in that study got 4.1%. So there's
Well,
a lot of work to do, and many athletes are waking up to this reality. And so I also have the good fortune of having athletes who are Olympic bound, reach out to me. Maybe they read something that I wrote in the public sphere and they contact me behind the scenes, and I can't help but support them. One of the athletes who I'm not going to name them publicly, but they leaked a document to me ahead of the Tokyo Olympics where it was a really interesting situation where on one hand, the IOC and local organizers were saying, oh, everybody's going to be safe. No worries. We know coronavirus is here, but we're going to make it safe for all athletes. There's going to be this thing called the Olympic bubble. On the other hand, they were sending out these waivers to these athletes saying, you need to sign this document if you want to participate, that says that if you die of coronavirus, you cannot sue the IOC or the local organizers.
oh
And
well.
so this particular athlete sent it to me and said, what do you think of this? And I said, wow, do you mind if I take that public at some point? And the person said, yeah, you can do that. And so I waited and I shared it with some pretty big national level television show in Japan. And
Mhm.
so I guess what I'm saying is these athletes are smart today, and I couldn't help but support them in any way that I can. And so I'm kind of dedicated to critiquing the unjust processes and also supporting these worker athletes.
Yeah. And so in that regard, do you have some hope for the future of the Olympics? I mean, do you think that the Olympics belong anymore? And if there are changes that are more beneficial to the athletes themselves, and the human rights abuses, there's so many things that have to be addressed or fixed. I mean, is it possible, or would we be better off without this global spectacle?
Well, if you would have asked me this question 10 years ago, I would have a very different answer than I do today. 10 years ago or so, 2014, the New York Times reached out to me and kind of said, hey, would you be interested in writing a magic wand kind of essay, where if you could fix the Olympics with your magic wand, what would you do? And I thought, okay, yeah, I'll do that. And so I put forth what I think is a good faith effort. All the ideas were relatively inside the box, which is to say doable. It wasn't
Mhm.
anything too extreme in my suggestions. And the International Olympic Committee summarily, just ignored everything I said. I mean, and I thought, okay, they don't have to listen to me, of course. But today, I actually think that the International Olympic Committee is no longer up to the task. And so I think that moving forward, and this might sound radical, but I want to sort of stress that this is a slow, kind of cold evolution of my thinking. I think the IOC has to go. It has to either be reconstituted by some of these athletes, critical minded athletes, not just any athletes, like, yes, people athletes, but
Mhm.
critical thinking athletes could do a whole lot better. And, there are groups that are popping up all around the world right now. Just to name one, there's a group called Global Athlete, which I think your listeners and viewers would really find interesting. Global Athlete is right out front fighting for athlete rights. I mean, I could take 10 athletes that I know are affiliated with them and say, yeah, you could run the Olympics better than the International Olympic Committee right now. And so, yeah, I just think the time is up for the International Olympic Committee. They don't care about human rights, really. they're not really interested in democracy. They say that athletes are first, but all too often athletes are last. And I mean, how many chances are we going to give them, especially after all the corruption that we hear time and again? Not just the Salt Lake City Olympic scandal, which probably a lot of your listeners and viewers have heard of, but even more recently around the Tokyo Olympics, there appears to be some serious vote buying, some ongoing corruption investigations moving their way through the French courts and to the Japanese courts now too. And so with all that just piling up, I think, okay, we need to shift gears and have other people run it. Or else maybe we do need to think about just hitting the pause button and until we can get it right in terms of these principles of justice, democracy, fairness that are, again, enshrined in the Olympic Charter.
Right. Wow. Well, so much to discuss. This is I highly recommend the book, 1936 Berlin Olympics, Race Power in Sports Washing. Jules, congratulations on this book. And for those who are just interested in your sensibilities, and the types of stories and books that you write, where can people find you and follow you?
Yeah, thanks. I'm on Twitter at Jules Boykoff, and I have a website where I catalog some of my writings. It's just my name, julesboykoff.org. So easily findable on email as well. So if anyone has a question or anything they'd like to follow up, just send me an email or connect with me on Twitter. But thanks so much, Andrew, for having me on. It's a great pleasure. Again, big fan of your work. So this means a lot to me. So thanks very much.
Thanks. A Mutual Admiration Society, and hopefully we'll have a chance to bring you to Nashville. We're hoping to put together some sort of sports and society conference next academic year. So I'll definitely be in touch about that. But keep up the great work, and thanks again.
Okay, thank you.